Well, hello there, my friends. Welcome to a beautiful Labor Day. Actually, it's supposed to be picking up to be a windstorm here in Portland in a couple hours, but it's totally calm out there, totally quiet, hot, a little humid, and a little smoky. But that's kind of beside the point. I came here to talk about violence, but I thought I'd start off on a soft note, right? The question I wanted to ask is, when is violence necessary? When is it required? When is violence acceptable? And without giving it much thought, some people might say violence is never acceptable. But let's first define what we mean by violence. Violent, the word, and by the way, I'd like to say first off, this just came to mind a few minutes ago when I heard a story from someone that made me think that I might have to, get angry or take action, let's say. Might have to get violent if things get bad. It has to do with something I don't even want to get into, but I know people are going to be like, well, what? What? It's nothing big. It's one of those situations where you say, well, if this happened, if somebody came to my home to do this or do that, then I would have to get violent to defend myself. And it's one of those cases where it's acceptable to be violent. I remember talking with a guy once, and we got into a discussion about self-defense, and he said it's in God's hands. And I said, well, if somebody broke into your house and they were going to kill you and your family, and you had a chance to stop them, would you? And he said, no, it's in God's hands. That's the kind of person who I know is either A, completely full of it, or B, just, has a completely the wrong mindset about defending your own family. For me, I'd do anything for my family, and I would get extremely violent if I had to. That said, I'm not a violent person. I've only been in one real fist fight in my life. Well, two fights. But I was really young at the first one, like third, fourth grade. Some guy, I left my diary at his house, and he told me I had to come fight him to get it. So I walked up to his house. It was like 8 blocks, and he was a football kid, and so he wanted to run and tackle me. So he's like, stand there, and he ran to tackle me, and I leaned back as he tackled and dove, and I just leaned back and stuck my knee out, and basically his face bounced off my knee. He came off just bloody and ran to his daddy. I grabbed my diary and my backpack and went home. Um, Nothing happened again until like 8th grade, and the whole year during 7th grade, some guy had been harassing me, and I have a point to this. He'd called me all these different stupid names. My last name is Orr, O-R-R, so he'd call me Whore, Josh Whore, Josh Whore. And finally, the first week of 8th grade, after I'd endured a whole year of his bullshit before, he started it again. And something overcame me, and I pushed him against the lockers, and I said, "You want to go?" Something like that. And he just clocked me hard, just boom, right in the eye. And I had a shiner for a long time. But after he clocked me, I stumbled back a couple feet, and adrenaline took over, and I put him in a headlock and just pounded his ass. That sounds wrong, doesn't it? I beat his ass. No, I punched his head. How about that? And then after this was all over, the bell rang. We went back to class. This was back in the good old days before, every kid who got in any fight goes home or gets suspended. And nobody knew. Everybody parted ways, and we all went back to class. At the end of the year, we became friends, and I've talked to him even in recent years. Same with the other guy. It's one of those things where you get in fights, it's not a big deal. Violence isn't always a means to permanently injure or maim or harm someone. But the point I wanted to make with that was he violated my sanctity of my own personal things, so therefore violence ensued. And as I wanted to say, sometimes I have notes, and this is all off the top of my head. So forgive me if I stumble into something maybe that's incoherent or hard for me to explain. I I guess I should touch on these riots that are going on right now, and it's people are so word sensitive that I have to use the word riots because somebody will point it out if I say protests. There are lots of protests going on, And there are a high percentage, over 90% of, you know, these protests are peaceful. However, this small percentage, and I live in Portland, well, across the bridge from Portland in Vancouver, Washington. As a lot of you know who watch my channel, I went down to well, at the point, it was a protest that night, the second night of protests in Portland. And I filmed it from the very front lines by the gate. There were some instigators, there are always troublemakers, and there are always people trying to stop those troublemakers. And I don't want to really get into the details because if I start talking about the riots, people will instantly lose interest in the whole subject and just get obsessed with the riots themselves rather than the violence that I'm talking about. Violence is something that comes out of people when they feel like they're slighted. And we all know right now with what's going on with these riots, it's not all Black Lives Matter. It's not all about racism. It is about systematic injustice, which the prison industrial complex has made it very easy to get sucked in. And most people realize that we have a major issue with police. That issue is not being addressed because there is so much violence towards the police from these small groups of rioters that the focus is laser focus on these particular people. Every night it's the same thing in Portland. And the night before last was day 100 of protests. And I told myself, of course, it's going to get nasty. And naturally it did. People were throwing Molotov cocktails, fireworks, everything you can imagine, marching through neighborhoods. And I want to make it clear, regardless of what some of my subscribers think, I'm actually very disgusted with the way that some of these people act. I mean, if you're out there throwing fireworks in neighborhoods and throwing rocks and bottles and Molotovs at cops, you're an asshole, as far as I'm concerned. That's said from a person who has a serious issue with police, and I know we need reform. But the reason I bring this up is to ask, is violence always, I should say, is violence ever acceptable as an option? Is it ever acceptable to burn mattresses or picnic tables in the middle of a road? Is it acceptable to throw rocks and bottles and light buildings on fire? If you are burning down a small business, you are a piece of shit. The other night they broke into a dentist's office underneath an apartment building a week ago and lit that on fire. There are some seriously dangerous people out there. The point I wanted to make there was that people are hijacking a legitimate protest for legitimate reasons for their own violent needs, because it has nothing to do with the needs of others, but rather what you would call, a lot of these kids are the Trustafarians, the people who, have never really faced any real adversity in their own lives. They just never taken any initiative to do anything. And that's harsh to say, because then from the liberal side, I'll be considered to be some hater of liberals. And no matter what I say on the other side, people will, call me a liberal or say I'm some, soft-hearted. When I made that video, I didn't necessarily support the protesters. I supported their right to protest, but not the people who were committing acts of violence. And it's not that I don't believe violence is never warranted. It's that I believe it was leveraged towards the wrong groups. And let me make this clear. I don't really have any issues with people who want to attack a government building, a federal building especially. People seem to have a misunderstanding of, that I supported like people looting and burning. No, it was about making a statement. You don't hear about what's going on in the nation right now in the media. Believe me, you might hear about what's going on in Portland. But do you know what happened in New York the other night? Or, you might hear about Kenosha, Wisconsin, because you see it on the media and it's in everywhere, hashtags and everything else. But what about some of the smaller towns? Rochester. What's going on in the other places in America? LA, San Diego, San Francisco. the media is doing a really good job of hiding the chaos that is going on in the world right now. And on the subject of violence, I just wanted to propose, rather ask, I guess, a question, not propose anything. You know, I'm a big supporter and follower of intelligent people, intellectuals, but some people have been getting so sucked into this left right paradigm that it's almost hard to navigate anything anymore. Like Brett Weinstein, for example. He was harassed by liberals. He was one of the first people who showed me that people on the left can be extreme and that these social justice warriors can be just some absurd people. But that's coming from a guy who posted something earlier on Twitter who said social justice should never be a bad thing. I believe that social justice is important, but I also believe that a lot of people use that as a rather an excuse to just do horrible acts, you know, just to go out and protest for the sake of protesting. You might call them career protesters. They make everybody really look bad. If you have a cause, stand for it. But it's not about fighting the system for the sake of just looking right or feeling righteous. And looking back on the video I just made, I don't know whether I should even post it. It's like, if there's any point I would want to make, it would be bridging the gap between left and right. But that's absurd because I know it's not possible. But I do know that if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would say, well, I'm a liberal and I'm a social justice warrior. I'll stand up for anybody who's a minority. Now both of those terms have become so corrupted and so dirtied that the ambiguity about believing anything has become so extreme that we as individuals don't even know what to believe anymore, who to believe, what values to have, what morals to have, and therefore we slowly pull ourselves apart further and further until we're in opposite camps to the point where we can't even have a discussion with another person who believes the same thing we do. You see that? I bit my tongue. I was going to bring up politics, decided not to. Well, that's about all I got on this one. I just wanted to make that point, and talk about violence, but really just a general discussion. I guess one of the bigger questions I wanted to ask, but I was going to do it in a separate video. Oh man, it's tough. Well, I was going to talk about what to do with violent people and whether or not we know the prison industrial complex is corrupt. We know that people are thrown in prison for, drug crimes all the time and that a lot of money is wasted. I have notes up there that I was going to use about the drug war. I have strong hatred for the drug war and believe in legalization of every drug in its own way, and there's a process for that, but the point being that we have a lot of prisoners, and I don't believe people should be in prison. It's almost violence just to have people in prison, especially for drug crimes. But for people who are truly violent, rapists, murderers, thieves, sorry, not even thieves, that's not fair. Thieves kind of fit in their own category. Some people steal because they have to. There are a lot of reasons. But the same thing with murderers. If you intentionally murder somebody, it's different than having a circumstantial issue where you are accidentally killed somebody in a fit of passion or rage. Or, and that's the thing, it's so difficult to navigate what a crime or an angry or hateful crime would be. But let's just say for the people who we know are violent, who are repeat offenders, who harm others, what do we do with those people? You know, it's violent to kill them, but it's also violent to lock them up in prison for their whole lives. It's violent and violating to make the people pay for their imprisonment. Sounds selfish, and it is, but there are a lot of shitty people out there who live in the prison system and just, suck our tax dollars. And I think, well, that's mean to think that way, but at the same time, who am I to say they're really criminals? It's very difficult to know what's real and what's not, who's a criminal, who's not. But I guess I wanted to just touch on all those things, and I think I have. And it looks like the video's been about 15 minutes, so that's not too bad. That's 15 minutes of free thinking, my friends. Thanks for coming, and I'll talk to you all later. Be well.